Good night. Happy New Year.
The pub walk of Nicolas Maduro, who just a few days ago helmed Venezuela as president, is sending shockwaves across the world. The U.S. move on Maduro is being seen as the biggest signal yet that Trump has heralded a new world order, or should we call it a new world disorder. Live from Singapore, this is Insight with Haslinda Amin, where we dive deeper into the stories that matter with crucial context and sharp analysis.
We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
Questions swirl over Venezuela's leadership and Trump's plan to revive the country's oil industry, a years-long effort that could cost more than $100 billion. China says it's deeply shocked by the U.S. action and condemned the move, but many in the country see it as a template for how Beijing can handle Taiwan. Meanwhile, markets look past geopolitics as the equity rally built on last year's gains in chip makers and artificial intelligence-linked companies. Copper and gold continue their record run. Investors weighing the impact of the U.S. capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro on global crude supply. Equity markets, however, appear to be shrugging off geopolitical risks. A gauge of emerging markets is at an all-time high, with optimism for AI and tech driving the strongest start to a year since 2012. Venezuela's acting president says she is inviting the U.S. to work with her country after an American operation to capture President Nicolas Maduro. The U.S. swooped into Caracas over the weekend, seizing Maduro and flying him to New York to face drugs and weapons charges. President Trump earlier said the U.S. plans to run Venezuela with elections due eventually.
Well, we're going to run everything. We're going to run it, fix it. We'll have elections at the right time. But the main thing you have to fix is a broken country.
Our Latin America executive editor Creighton Harrison joins us from Mexico City. Creighton, what's the latest? What do we know about the mood in Venezuela right now?
Well, within Venezuela, it's still very, very confusing. The fog is lifting a little bit, and we know more than we did 36 hours ago. But everyone's treading very, very carefully right now. You may have seen footage around the world of Venezuelans celebrating the removal of Nicolas Maduro, the president, but those were not in Caracas. Those were in other cities around the world where a lot of Venezuelans have left over the years to places like Madrid and Miami. So within Venezuela, things are very, very quiet. There was sort of an initial run on grocery stores and pharmacies in the sort of immediate aftermath when people were hearing a lot of explosions and not sure what to expect next. But since then, things have calmed down, and the government has been telling people through state TV that the bakeries are going to be open tomorrow. Everything is going to be back to normal. Just go about your lives, go to work, do your thing. So the message is just normalcy. Within the government, of course, there's obviously an attempt right now to figure out who's in charge. And so far, Delcy Rodriguez, who was the vice president under Maduro, as you mentioned, now the acting president, does seem to have the upper hand, and that includes having some kind of relationship with the U.S.
That said, the question swirling around about who's in charge. President Trump says the U.S. will run Venezuela. What change will come? What is the plan?
Well, what the Trump administration is banking on is that they will have a partner, whether it's Delcy Rodriguez or somebody else, who will work with them to implement what they want to implement in Venezuela. And what Trump has talked about the most is improving the oil infrastructure and getting more oil flowing from Venezuela. Now, Delcy Rodriguez is a former oil minister. She knows that industry very, very well. So that may be one reason that they've chosen to work with her. But they've also said if they get signs that she's not going to be cooperative, then they have other options. They do have the oil blockade that they've continued to enforce in the Caribbean. And of course, they have shown what will happen if they really, really don't get cooperation from someone in Venezuela.
It's not just about Venezuela. Marco Rubio talked about remaking Latin America. He cited Cuba in a speech. Is there clarity on what is meant there?
Well, Trump also has talked about this idea of the Monroe Doctrine, which, of course, you may know from your history books, was sort of this idea that the U.S. has a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere across the Americas, and sees a strategic reason to intervene in governments in the region and to sort of make its presence felt. So he's embraced that in a big way as a sort of a calling card of the Trump 2 administration in ways that it really wasn't in Trump 1. And Venezuela, as sort of the biggest state that was sort of diametrically opposed to the Trump administration, is getting this sort of treatment. You can imagine others like Cuba are also, in the conversation. What Trump has said a couple of times now is that Cuba may just take care of itself, that they won't have to do anything else because he hasn't said this out loud, but in part, we would imagine because Cuba gets a lot of oil from Venezuela and is really dependent on it economically. So that's one in particular that we're going to be watching very closely because certainly in Havana they're very concerned about this.
Creighton, thank you so much for that. Bloomberg's Latin America Executive Editor, Creighton Harrison. Let's get insights on Venezuela with our panel of guests. Samir Puri is a noted geopolitical analyst and author of Restlessness and the Great Imperial Hangover. He previously worked for the UK Foreign Office. Rachel VanLandingham is a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and now professor of law at Southwestern Law School, LA. She's a national security law expert and former active duty judge advocate in the U.S. Air Force. Samir, let's start with you. Is there any legal justification at all that can be invoked to justify the move that we saw from the U.S. on a sovereign nation?
Can be invoked. Yes, believable, defensible, maybe less so. And we've had a bit of a run-up because of the US military strikes, unilateral strikes on alleged drug boats over the last few months. And what was invoked then was self-defense. And it was sort of like 9/11 and counterterrorism, which was, this is a threat to the homeland, therefore we can take preemptive action. Now, the problem is tracing a direct link between drugs and gang activity and loss of life on the US homeland, legally speaking, is rather hard. You can do it in a sort of polemical, rhetorical sense because you do it in a court of law. But I actually think this is more about power than law. There's no one powerful enough to stop America, to block their actions, to check them as they make this move. This will now come down to whether they can capitalize on this regime change quickly and achieve some of the successes they've presented in quite an aggrandized sense. They've really set themselves a huge task. They're going to try to brush over the questions around the legality.
There may not be legal jurisdiction, yet it's happened before, right? Noriega, Milosevic, there is justification in all of those.
Well, Milosevic, there were, of course, UN-related actions in relation to the breakup of Yugoslavia, same with Iraq and Saddam Hussein. It's interesting, this is exactly 36 years to the day that Manuel Noriega was seized, 1990, which is, I think, maybe coincidental, who knows. But Grenada, 1983, Panama, 1990, they're very small places in comparison to Venezuela, which is a pretty large country, one of the biggest crude oil suppliers in the world. So I think there's a question of scale. In your backyard, these quick imperial actions in a very small country. Grenada's a tiny island, of course. Venezuela, this is another matter. The scale, I think, is really important here.
And your thoughts on that, Rachel? Is there legal jurisdiction? I mean, is there justification at all?
To be honest, absolutely not. What President Trump's administration just did is a fundamental threat to the international legal order that was established by the United States and its allies following World War II to prevent World War III, essentially, and to put might makes right aside and instead provide that the use of force will be last resort versus first resort. And we saw first resort here. The claim that the United States was in some kind of non-international armed conflict against criminal drug gangs was nonsensical and does not comport with international law. The United States military was committing murder and has killed approximately 130 individuals in these illegal boat strikes. Now what we saw on Saturday was a violation of Venezuela's sovereign integrity, its territorial integrity, in direct violation of the United Nations Charter and international law. There is no excuse. There was no self-defense excuse. There was no imminent threat of an armed attack against the United States. There was no ongoing non-international armed conflict. As your other guests mentioned, this is about power and control, and it's shocking how quickly and easily this administration is willing to slough off the actual law and to disregard it. The administration claimed this is a extraterritorial law enforcement measure. There is no such thing without the consent of that sovereign country. Yes, there was an indictment against Mr. Maduro and now one, and a superseding one, and now one against his wife in U.S. federal court. That does not give the United States permission to invade that country and take him and capture him. He's technically now a prisoner of war. Technically, the United States and Venezuela are in an international armed conflict, and that is quite shocking. And I would like to highlight, we have major differences between what happened in Panama in 1989 and what happened now. Primarily, there was a much stronger argument for self-defense of U.S. citizens. We had 35,000 U.S. citizens in Panama at the time. We had several service members, one killed by Panamanian armed forces, one severely beaten, the wife interrogated. We had the Panamanian Assembly, their parliamentary body, declare war on the United States. So yes, while Panama, the United Nations General Assembly, did condemn the United States for violating the UN Charter there because it didn't feel like the threat was imminent enough, the United States was on much stronger ground, and it's in stark contrast to the violation of Venezuela's sovereignty here.
Right. Rachel, some say, though, there are presidential findings that actually authorize the use of force in Venezuela. How do you react to that? What's the response?
Well, those presidential findings are as, paper thin as the ones that found that waterboarding was not torture back in the GWAT under President George Bush. Just because there are findings that what the president is doing is lawful doesn't make them so. And this is really a form of lawfare. It's a perversion of the law that the Trump administration is engaged in. That really is no different than what we've seen Russia engage in and other, frankly, authoritarian states. So that is frankly disturbing. However, we do have the separate issue of a federal prosecution now of Mr. Maduro and his wife, and the U.S. courts have had, there's longstanding precedent that the manner of capturing and detaining an individual and obtaining personal jurisdiction over them is separate and distinct from the legality of their prosecution. However, there will be road bumps here. There will be speed bumps because the president, usually presidents, heads of state have what's called head of state immunity. The Trump administration will argue that he was illegitimate and he was not the true head of state. We've had the Supreme Court of the United States not very long ago declare that all official acts by head of state, particularly President Trump, are immune. So we're going to see some interesting legal arguments in that case. So we will have a parallel prosecution. But I would love to hear more from your other guests regarding what next for Venezuela. Where is the plan? We don't hear much of a plan. We hear the president's rhetorical threats that the United States is running Venezuela and that he's willing to put boots on the ground. I was in Iraq numerous times, deployed as an active duty United States military officer. We did not do well in Iraq. We didn't have much of a plan. We had more of a plan than we have here. So it's really troubling and disturbing to know that our administration engaged in this, and they're not really sure what's going to happen next.
Samir, let's pose that question to you. How do you see the U.S. running Venezuela? Will we see elections? Because Trump has not said anything about that.
So the biggest thing, and Rachel has rightly pointed to Iraq here, is the law and order question. Will law and order and security be maintained? As everybody knows, the lesson the US learned from Iraq was abolishing the police and the military. And that was something that created a space for gangs and criminality. Now, of course, the accusation there are gangs and there's criminality in Venezuela is reasonable. And so the possibility there's a descent into violence in some way, shape or form, maybe not necessarily in Caracas, maybe in outlying regions, because this is such a destabilizing action to happen. Imagine you wake up one morning and the president of your country, whether you love him or hate him, has been whisked away and taken to New York. I mean, all of a sudden, all sorts of forces may be unleashed within society. So we have to wait and see whether the US's light touch operation here, which is not deploying a large civilian administration as it did in Iraq, they're not abolishing the apparatus of government. I think they're hoping Venezuela just ticks on as it has, just with new leadership. That is a huge assumption to be tested. But I would also say, just in terms of, as Rachel mentioned, Ukraine, just very, very quickly, I think that the US has been inadvertently inspired by Russia here. I think they are preparing the chessboard for the great geopolitical contest of our time, which is between emergent, rising superpowers, and they are wanting to grab as much power and influence as they can in the Western Hemisphere. And I think Vladimir Putin will be the one in his mind taking some credit for giving Trump the idea that this can be a new imperial age.
So fair to say, this is the new world order. You can see unilateral moves by big countries, and there's no intervention from anyone else in the world.
Yeah, there is no restraining force. There are no norms. The UN, of course, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, obviously condemned what happened, but what does that mean in practice? New world order, but with heavy doses of the old world of empires. I wrote this book, Great Imperial Hangover, a few years ago. It's about the fact that the temptation of empire never goes away. You see it exercised in different fashion, but this is Teddy Roosevelt. This is 19th century American kind of strong-arming politics in South America. And it is also, and I do believe Hegseth and Trump's characterization, this is also to check the possible rise and the actual rise of Chinese influence in parts of South America. I think Brazil, very, very interesting. Of course, Brazil's biggest trading partner is now China. Not that Brazil is being targeted, but this is going to cause panic in Brazil.
But Greenland is being targeted. Absolutely yes to Greenland, says Trump.
Well, we have to wait and see. And this is the thing, again, with the 9/11 analogy. Remember, Iraq regime change, straight after Afghanistan regime change. They hadn't finished one, they moved on to the other. And I think that pattern is very important here when we're trying to predict what happens in the future. Has the American government, I'm not condoning their imperial action here, do they basically move too quickly and start something else somewhere else, whether it's Cuba, whether it's Greenland, or do they try to consolidate the gains? My concern is they move very, very quickly and try to open another theatre, because Trump seems to think the spectacular military operation to grab Maduro is game, set and match, and everything else will play out as he has predicted. It's going to be very, very complicated, and it may not be the case.
And Rachel, we know that Maduro and his wife are due to appear in a New York court on Monday. What can be expected, and why New York and not some other state in the U.S.?
Well, that's where the Department of Justice obtained their indictments, and the Southern District of New York has handled international, or national cases before of international dimension. For example, in the Southern District of New York, just a year and a half ago, there was a case against the only Taliban member that was actually prosecuted in U.S. federal court, Mr. Najibullah, who was prosecuted for attempted murder and murder of U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. We can expect them to enter pleas. We expect them to see who will be representing them, what federal defense counsel will be representing Mr. Maduro and his wife. And it is interesting to see, because Mrs. Maduro is technically considered a protected person. She's a civilian who is detained by a party in an international armed conflict, and Mr. Maduro is technically a prisoner of war, and so that really governs the conditions of their treatment. It does not, however, preclude actual prosecution within U.S. federal court, as we saw with General Noriega several decades ago.
Rachel, does a leader of a sovereign nation have immunity from prosecution? I mean, how might this play out?
Yes, in customary international law, as well as in U.S. law, acting heads or sitting heads of state have immunity from prosecution in order so they can conduct their business as heads of state. What we will see is that, for example, General Noriega was never the legitimate head of state of Panama. There was an elected president that the election was stolen from him and was immediately sworn in after the United States invaded in 1989. And we'll see a similar argument, I think, from the United States government here that Mr. Maduro illegitimately seized power in 2024. But it's going to be interesting to see if that immunity, though, goes back to when he was a legitimate elected leader of Venezuela, because he stole the election in 2024, but he was the head of state prior to that. So there will be legal issues that will be playing out over the months ahead.
Rachel, we know that Maduro and his wife are being detained in a jail in Brooklyn. Could you tell us more about the conditions and where he's at right now?
Well, I've never visited that particular facility. I mean, it really has to accord the same protections and meet the same standards as what a prisoner of war would be accorded. And we saw the courts in General Noriega's case leave that to the executive branch to ensure that occurred. I was an expert witness in a case regarding the Taliban that was prosecuted, and alleged Taliban member that was prosecuted a year and a half ago in the Southern District of New York, and he was held in those same facilities. And it's not the palace that Mr. Maduro and his wife are accustomed to.
And Samir, we talked about how the world seems to be condoning unilateral action, especially from the U.S. I'm just wondering whether the likes of China might use it as a template, as a blueprint for its own moves on Taiwan.
Yeah, this is the biggest, I think, worry for the wider world. There's obviously huge ramifications in South America for the Americas, but the wider world is this the law of the jungle being sanctioned by the superpower that was previously the upholder of the rules-based international order? What a turnaround in the space of just 14 months or so. This is really worrying, I think, for Asia. And I think one of the biggest conundrums we've already seen for the US's closest allies in Asia, like Japan, also allies in Europe, like the UK and France, what statement can they possibly issue? They don't want to burn their ties and their bridges with Washington, D.C. They don't want to anger Trump. But equally, they are horrified by what's happened because this is not the world they want to be living in. These medium-sized powers, let alone smaller powers, and countries where, like Taiwan and places like Taiwan, where there's a historical grievance and a big superpower waiting to envelop them. Having said all of that, I do think this still rests on whether the US can produce a success from this. What the US has shown, I think one very quick, interesting comparison is they snatched Maduro very successfully. There'll be, I think, some arrogance and braggadocio in the Pentagon that, well, the Russians tried to snatch and kill Zelensky in 2022. They failed. And I think actually the Chinese will be looking at this and seeing this also in practical terms. What precedent does this set for a clean regime change or regime decapitation operation? Because it does set a very unfortunate precedent. And I think those are unfortunately the terms we should be thinking about. There's also the US demonstrating its efficiency in being able to do this. And just one last observation, it's really interesting to reflect on Panama. Panama, of course, helped to give the US some confidence after Vietnam in the early 70s, mid-70s. I think Pete Hegseth, all those veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, they want to give the US military this sense that they are ready for a new world and they're exercising the demons of the defeats in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Great insights. Rachel VanLandingham of Southwestern Law School of LA, geopolitical analyst Samir Puri will be staying with us. Now, Venezuela coverage continues on Insight with SVB Energy International and the Kautilya School of Public Policy. In the next hour, we'll get the view from Beijing with the Center for China and Globalization. Those interviews happening at the times on your screen. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Here's a look at Asian benchmarks. It does seem like Venezuela having little impact on market sentiment and the risk appetite. The MSCI Asia-Pac Index continued to climb upwards, up by 1.6% at a new record high. The Taipei Index is also in positive territory, lifted by tech stocks. Still to come, more on Venezuela. Keep it here with us.
in order for Venezuela to unlock its vast potential, 300 billion barrels of oil in reserves, there is a need for a stable government to attract international investment.
The Trump administration would like to see is the Venezuela-Cuba nexus, especially as it pertains to oil production. Venezuela used to give a lot of oil to Cuba. Some of it was used for domestic consumption. A lot of it was sold onward to international markets, netting revenue for the Cuban regime. It wants to see that connection severed.
I think the answer is probably less in the politics of it, but more in the chemistry of oil. And my answer is that, one, there is a lot of hype around. I saw the previous person, greatest oil reserves at 300 billion barrels. That is wrong. Those are paper barrels. This oil is twice as heavy as the normal Middle Eastern barrels.
Bloomberg TV guests weighing the impact of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's ouster to global crude supply. We're tracking moves in crude oil today after the U.S. captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, raising questions about what's next for the oil-rich nation's energy industry. Markets also digesting Morgan Stanley cutting oil forecasts for the coming 3 quarters on expectations that a global oil market surplus will expand before peaking at mid-year. The analysts now expect Brent crude to trade below $60 per barrel through the third quarter before recovering. Now, this comes as OPEC Plus is sticking with its plans to pause crude supply increases in the first quarter as the group awaits clarity on whether the U.S. capture of Venezuela's leader will impact supplies. Let's get more with oil reporter Nicholas Loa. Nicholas, it does seem like there's been little impact, huge move by the U.S., but, a small impact on the oil market.
You're totally right, Haslinda. I think we've seen oil fall as much as 1.2% early at the open, but it's since clawed back its losses, right? We're actually trading more or less flattish right now. And I think that reflects how, as you've rightly pointed out, in the grand scheme of things, fundamentals haven't really shifted. We're still seeing oil on water, the oil oversupply. It's staggering, right? And that hasn't gone away. And some of that's going to offset any disruptions that might come out of Venezuela in the short term. We've heard a lot today about how in the long term there's going to be as much as $100 billion of investment in the Venezuelan oil sector. That's the kind of money we need to bring their sector up to speed, right? And that's a long way in the coming. That's not right now. Yes, exactly.
Months.
Exactly. And so I think that's why in the short term, as you've pointed out, a lot of the investment banks are still seeing things relatively bearish. As you pointed out, Morgan Stanley is cutting its forecast to below 60. Goldman Sachs, traditionally very bullish on oil, also after the shock of today, holding their base forecast steady, in fact.
We've talked about how Trump is looking at, American companies to invest in the oil infrastructure in Venezuela. To date, only Chevron has been the only one. What other companies do you think might show interest?
So I think the big players are all quite familiar names, right? We're looking at Exxon, we're looking at ConocoPhillips. All these are the big oil companies that I think are part of that Trump sees as part of his big drill baby drill plan. So I think that's not going away. So I think all eyes are on them. But I think another thing worth flagging, of course, is the eerie quiet that's come out since the events of the weekend. Aside from Chevron reiterating that it is able to export some oil to the U.S. under a special dispensation where the sanctions that apply to, where U.S. sanctions on Venezuelan oil don't apply to them, I think not much else has come out from the other U.S. oil majors. And I think this also reflects the big challenge that comes when it comes to rebuilding the sector that's been underinvested in for a really long time.
How about Asian companies, the likes of Reliance? Don't they have contracts in Venezuela?
You're right to point to that, Haslinda, actually. And I think one of the interesting things to note is we've heard a bit about chemistry today, right? The crude that comes out of Venezuela, now that's heavy sour crude. And so what that means is that there are only a limited number of refineries with the advanced technology capable of processing that. On one hand, Trump is right. The U.S. Gulf Coast refiners are able to process this heavy crude. But there are players far-flung elsewhere in the world, including Reliance, whose mega refinery is one of the most sophisticated dictator in the world, right? So in terms of people with equity, in terms of people who can actually take advantage of that crude directly, put its barrels in and push that out into products, yes, you're right, Reliance and a couple of the others.
Nicholas, great perspective. Thank you. Bloomberg oil reporter Nicholas Lois there. Our next guest is a globally renowned energy security strategist. Let's get perspective from Sara Vakhshouri, president and founder of consulting firm SVB Energy International. And still with us, Samir Puri, noted geopolitical analyst and author of Restlessness and the Great Imperial Hangover. Sara, let's start with you. This muted reaction in the oil market, it has to do with that glut, doesn't it?
I wouldn't say it has to do with glut, but the fact that Venezuela didn't have a significant role in the market already, the production was not significant and was not supplied into the international markets. It was going into the black market, mostly to China. So I would say, yes, the market is well supplied, but nothing to do with glut, because there hasn't been any interruption of Venezuelan supply, attack on infrastructure, or any perception or any expectations of Venezuelan supply interruption.
We know that Trump is keen to get Venezuelan oil to flow again. What will that take?
Well, this has multiple layers if we look at it. One is that the current production and export of Venezuela, since the sanctions, Iran, Russia, and China were mostly working on the logistics of sending this oil into the black market and ultimately to China. The first cargo of Venezuelan oil that left Venezuela after the sanctions was in Iranian vessel. And also they were exporting condensate to Venezuela to dilute some of this heavy oil. And also they increased the refinery capacity. So the first and immediate flow or impact of U.S. The recent event could be the removal of sanctions and the fact that Venezuelan oil could be supplied in the, let's say, clear, normal markets. Then we're talking about that would the oil flow and oil capacity and production increase? And that's obviously different story. There has been in the past 2 days a lot of speculations and a lot of estimates. But on average, what is an expectation is that it might take maybe, let's say, a year for additional few hundred, 500,000 barrels or closer to million. This is actually what happened in regard to Iran. But that's in the case that most of the international companies, the American and Europeans, already are incentivized to invest and pump out more oil in anticipation for, let's say, regaining their debt that Venezuela has to them. So if they would make more profit, get some of that debt back, there is incentive to pump more. But majority of that, we are looking at medium term. There are expectations of at least a need of $10 billion of investment on annual basis for another 3 to 6 years, even some estimates for 7 years to restore a Venezuelan capacity to what it used to be. And this is just from brownfields, no discussion of greenfield. But right. all of that, it just depends on if there is a stable government and regulations, sanctions being unwound, and companies feel safe and also incentivized to invest.
It does seem like Trump is keen to have a tighter control of the oil flows in Venezuela. Will tighter control mean that, he could help reshape the trade patterns in the Americas?
And that's obviously very important. If you look at it, again, like why this happened now, it's Venezuela is in U.S. Backyard. And 3 countries which are considered as U.S. adversaries, China, Russia, and Iran, are very closely integrated to countries' energy industry, defense, and also narcotics. So if you look at it closely, it was very important for U.S. national security what has happened. But specifically about the oil flow, as I mentioned, as Venezuela has been turned into a logistical hub for circumventing U.S. sanctions against both Iranian oil and also to a large extent Russian oil. So the recent event would, at least before any regulations have been set, would reduce these activities of sanctions circumvention by Russia and Iran in this region. So yes, as I mentioned, there are layers of control over the Venezuelan oil export flow and also production.
And implications on strategic alliances, Samir. I mean, you can only imagine that Russia, China will come together, the BRICS nation possibly also, getting closer together in response to what they're seeing in Venezuela.
Well, do you know, with BRICS, it's Brazil that's really the critical member of BRICS here because they have their direct exposure to what's happened. I mean, President Lula has been quite forthright in condemning what's happened in the last few days in Venezuela. Whether the BRICS will practically help is another question. And I think China and Russia are going to be looking at this with very mixed views. On the one hand, this is the world they want, a world of spheres of influence where the weak preyed upon by the strong. They want that in their neighbourhoods. Of course, the Russians want that in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet Union and Ukraine. On the other hand, they're going to be looking at whether this aggrandizes American power. And I think these views on the oil supply and trends are so interesting, are so important, because if the US can unlock this potential, and it is potential, it's reserves, it's not necessarily supply, as we're hearing in terms of Venezuelan oil. If the US unlocks that in the medium term, that buttresses its position in the great geopolitical contests of the 21st century. Namely, it ensures the US against possible loss of supply from the Middle East, further ensures them if the US takes decisive action against the Iranian regime in years to come. But it also means that they're set up very, very strongly to face off against China in this competition. But I think this still comes down to the possibility of whether the US can realize its huge ambitions in Venezuela, because I think this is all about potential now in terms of power and profits.
But the thing is, what the US did was pretty shocking. All countries must be assessing their strategic alliances. Would China be a more attractive partner in this case versus the US under Trump?
Such an interesting point, because China for the last 12 months, 13 months has been, and I've heard this from Chinese officials in global forums, presenting their country as a paragon of stability and virtue. And their target then was the tariffs. They were saying, look at those US tariffs, look at the destabilization that's caused your economies, look at what we're offering, which is stable long-term economic partnership. The extent to which China now capitalizes on this shock, and you're right to call it a shock. It's a shock that has, I think, shaken everyone out of their post-holiday stupor. They only just got back to work. Whether you're in a government, you're in a company, you're issuing statements, you're assessing the impact on your day-to-day activities, your medium-term planning. The Chinese are yet, I think, to very loudly trumpet themselves as a stabilizing force globally. They've got these different initiatives that they've put there, more on paper. Whether they capitalize on this in particular, we'll have to wait and see, but I would still say they'll always have one mind on Taiwan, and the possibility this is a really helpful precedent for any future responses they may want to take to actions and activities in the Taiwan Straits.
And Sarah, speaking of China, I'm just wondering, could China's demand for oil help defend oil prices?
Well, speaking of demand and Chinese demand, what we have seen in the past year is that China's demand has been stronger, more resilient than everybody expected, and China has been storing a lot of oil, which obviously contributed to its demand. But something that here I like to add, and it's very important because there has been so many discussions over oil in the past couple of days, and everybody tying this event to oil and oil reserves in Venezuela. Something that I like to refresh everybody's memory is that it was back in 2023 that Saudi energy minister, the largest oil producing country, said that energy security is not anymore about oil, but critical minerals. And this is very much important and critical for President Trump's administration. Critical minerals is no longer even a commodity that is important for energy security, but economic security, and also is a very strategic asset for defense. And if you go back to the history, now it feels like once upon a time that the U.S. has started to creating those strategic petroleum reserves to have enough fuel reserved for the time of defending the country for its jets. And now that has been replaced by critical minerals. U.S. cannot be dependent on China for all the minerals it needs for its economic security, for its defense and energy security. So we see that many people, and you just mentioned that this came at a shocking time. It was just not too long ago, right last year, that threaten U.S. to put a ban on export of rare earth materials and minerals to United States. And we see that it was not China only taking discounted oil from Venezuela, but China started having activities in mines in Venezuela, starting extracting and taking through different channels, different countries in the neighboring countries of Venezuela. So it's not, and we discussed about the short-term and immediate importance of these events that United States, we see that how I mentioned for narcotic, for having 3 adversaries in one target for United States, Iran, Venezuela, and Iran, Russia, and China, turning Venezuela into a hub for circumventing sanctions, defense activities, narcotic against the United States right in U.S. neighborhood. But if you look at the long-term horizon, I know that there has been a lot of discussions about the assets and reserves of Venezuela in terms of oil, but we should also look into Chinese activity into all these minerals mine and the importance of all of that. There is a long list of minerals that maybe for the, I know that we have a limited time, but if people go and look at it from gold to all those minerals that are very important for U.S. national security, were in the mines that China was extracting them.
And Samir, to Sarah's point, power today lies in the hands of those who control minerals and energy and oil. And that will be the theme going forward.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to remember that Chinese rare earth minerals export control, that shocked the Americans because all of a sudden they've gone from decades, a century almost, of being the preeminent power in the world, not really being coerced by others because they've had access or directly control all the resource they need, to realizing they're in a world with a peer competitor, China. And I think there's interesting evolution. The first Trump administration, I think they wanted to constrain and block and basically push down China's rise. This administration, I think there's a realistic assessment that they can't keep China down, and they are facing the next few decades, the next century of peer competition. I don't think China's going to beat America in some great global contest. And it's so important to see this Venezuelan gambit engaged by the Americans as preparing that chessboard for the next phase of competition with China and securing their homeland, but also securing their access to resources.
But when it comes to rare earths, which is key for a lot of sectors today, how does the U.S. catch up when China's had a 30-year head start?
It probably can't, and I think this is why in the long-term assessment of the US's ability to compete with China, some of that balance sheet is starting to look quite favourable to China, not only in terms of critical minerals, but also in terms of technology, innovations, massification of production, EVs, all the other things. There's that realisation. The Americans will never admit this, not that they're being beaten, but they can't win in every competition here. So I think it is why the Western Hemisphere has started to become much more attractive in a very pure, realpolitik, geopolitical power play sort of calculus. International law put to aside, the reaction of allies put to the side. It's about retaining the US's #1 status. Whether this is a boon to that or whether it backfires is, I think, something we're going to be talking about not only for this year, but I think for the next 3 years of the Trump administration.
And Sarah, when it comes to oil prices, given the backdrop we are in today, which is likely to persist, how do you see oil prices moving for the rest of the year?
Well, there are a lot of speculations and uncertainties, but we have discussed this many times in your program that among all the commodities, oil has been the one with the minimum fluctuations and volatility, and that goes the credit goes to the OPEC decisions. OPEC, since particularly COVID time, has been a very important factor in the market to stabilize the market and prices. And it feels like the market somehow is comfortable and convenient that OPEC would adjust its production based on market needs. And so far, this has been the case. If you look at it today, amid all these events and speculations over Venezuelan oil production, OPEC Plus meeting only took 10 minutes, which I would say this has been a signal to the market and assurance that in the short term, in the coming quarter or the next, Venezuelan issue is not going to be an important factor for the market. But again, OPEC's responsible and proactive strategy has created that calm and little volatility in compared to other commodities. and even in different energy commodities, oil had the minimum volatility, if you look at it, let's say in 2025. And that goes back to the OPEC market management. So it's most of the expectation. It could be around the same range if we don't have any unexpected factor in the market that could create either a supply shock or a demand shock. But otherwise, as we see, even the geopolitical factors have not had any huge impact on the market because, again, as was mentioned, energy security is not necessarily about oil anymore. There are lots of different suppliers in the market, different routes, and looking at algorithms and all the facilities and methodologies that now we have the satellites to track all the storages, real-time ships. It's been more rational and less prone to radical movements.
And of course, energy security key to India, which imports most of it all. Yet, when you take a look at India's reaction to that attack on Venezuela, has been pretty muted. Why do you think that is so?
India, like all these other countries, is desperately trying to balance its geopolitical relationships. And
of course,
it's a tightrope. And remember, the Indian-US bilateral relationship took the biggest blow it's taken in years after the Trump 50% tariffs just a few months ago. So I think there's probably also damage limitation here. I mean, what is it in it for India to then loudly condemn this? I mean, privately, of course, they're not going to be very happy with what's happened, like most countries. But I think the relationship with Trump was sort of hanging on a bit of a thread towards the end of last year. And I think there's no desire to have it snap entirely.
And a lot has to do with the trade negotiations, which are ongoing right now as well. I mean, it does want a lower tariff for its products.
Precisely, and this is why the US administration has got quite a number of countries, including India, in a bind because they have these trade negotiations. Some countries that have done well have reduced tariffs but not eliminated them entirely, as we all know. So which country is going to then jeopardize that negotiation by taking a moral stand over something that may be happening on the other side of the world? But this is also presumably part of how the White House has calculated they can get away with this in the court of international opinion. Is they're going to do this very, very quickly. They can withstand the criticism, and that criticism won't be unified. It won't be very loud. It won't go on for very long.
Great insights there. Sara Vakhshouri, president and founder of SVB Energy International, and noted geopolitical analyst Samir Puri. Thank you so much for joining us today. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Let's do a check on Indian markets. About 10 minutes after the open, the Sensex currently down about 0.2%. Sentiment getting hit a little, even though the broader market's not being impacted by Venezuela, having limited impact on global risk assets. In terms of Nifty index, is also in negative territory. Some of the movers we're keeping an eye on Indian oil companies, the likes of Reliance as well as ONGC. They're seen as key Indian beneficiaries of a prospective US-led takeover, as well as the restructuring of Venezuela's oil industry. According to Jefferies, it says that both companies stand to gain in terms of supplies, cash flows, and over time, valuations as well. Reliance currently up by 0.9%, ONGC higher by about 1%. More to come in our next hour of insight. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.
I think it sends a powerful deterrent signal to international regimes like the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, the Iranians, that the United States will not tolerate trying to trample that international order.
And this is about power and control, and it's shocking how quickly and easily this administration is willing to slough off the actual law and to disregard it.
I think they are preparing the chessboard for the great geopolitical contest of our time, which is between emergent rising superpowers, and they are wanting to grab as much power and influence as they can in the Western Hemisphere. And I think Vladimir Putin will be the one in his mind taking some credit for giving Trump the idea that this can be a new imperial age. New world order, but with heavy doses of the old world of empires.
Bloomberg TV guests reacting to Maduro's ouster and the political uncertainty in Venezuela. Venezuela's acting president says she is inviting the U.S. to work with her country after an American operation to capture President Nicolas Maduro. The U.S. swooped into Caracas over the weekend, seizing Maduro and flying him to New York to face drugs and weapons charges. President Trump earlier said the U.S. plans to run Venezuela, with elections due eventually.
We're going to run everything. We're going to run it, fix it. We'll have elections at the right time. But the main thing you have to fix is a broken country.
Our Latin America executive editor, Creighton Harrison, joins us from Mexico. Creighton, what's the latest? What do we know?
Well, what we know is that Delcy Rodriguez, who's sort of the acting president now, she was the vice president under Maduro, and the Supreme Court in Venezuela has given her all the presidential powers. She has come out with a statement tonight asking for cooperation with the U.S., a cooperative agenda, as she calls it, with the U.S. And this is a much more conciliatory tone than she had expressed yesterday when she came out on state television and was quite critical of the U.S. Intervention in Venezuela, the capture of the president, and had some pretty fiery words to describe that. But this statement was much more reserved and much more in the vein of, hey, maybe there's a way we can work together. That would align her, if she continues to kind of hold this sort of mentality, that would align her much more closely with what Trump has been describing, which is that she is willing to cooperate with the U.S. and work with the U.S. on its plans for Venezuela.
Still questions swirling around on who's really in charge. Who is in charge?
Well, if you're asking who's in charge between the U.S. and Venezuela, you'll get a different answer depending on which party you ask. In Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez and sort of the other lieutenants of the Maduro regime have all been on state TV every day. They're telling citizens to act like everything's normal, go to work tomorrow, etc. So they are sort of getting across that they're in charge. If you ask President Trump, he says we are running Venezuela now, right? So the truth is probably somewhere in between. It does sound like, again, if you sort of read between the lines of Delcy Rodriguez's statement tonight, that she is willing to work with the U.S. And so there is some gesture going on here to say that they will talk to each other about how the country will sort of be run going forward. But a charitable interpretation of that would be that it's going to be a shared responsibility. I think, you heard the president's words earlier. President Trump is very interested in running Venezuela and determining its fate.
Maria Machado, is it surprising that Trump says she has no respect to lead?
Well, as we reported yesterday, her inner circle was very surprised and I think deeply saddened by the president's comments. Not just that she wasn't picked to come run Venezuela, but also that he said that she didn't have the respect of the country. This is someone who won the vast majority of votes for her preferred candidate in 2024. So they are on the outside looking in at this point. It's an open question. Trump really hasn't talked about until tonight about elections in Venezuela, and even when he said that at some point they would have them, he was pretty vague about how that would work. So Machado's inner circle is kind of looking to a future where they may be able to get involved at some point down the road, but disappointing for them to not be involved right away.
Creighton, thank you. Bloomberg's Latin America executive editor, Creighton Harrison. Now, investors are weighing the impact of the U.S. capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro on global crude supply. Equity markets, however, appear to be shrugging off geopolitical risks. A gauge of emerging markets is at an all-time high, with optimism for AI and tech driving the strongest start to a year since 2012. Investors piling into tech, extending last year's rally in chips and other AI-related plays. Our Asia Equities reporter Winnie Xu joins us from Hong Kong. And Winnie, investors brushing off geopolitical risks, refocusing on that tech rally.
Yeah, morning has exactly. You can see that investors are really getting used to pricing in these geopolitical risks and digesting them quite quickly and focusing on what's going on in the AI space. And that's exactly what's going on in today's market as well. When you look at how Asian stocks hit another record, and also the emerging markets, like you mentioned, hit the record after a couple years. And that is really showing how that optimism around AI is still there. You're looking at the Japan's Nikkei 225 and also Kospi, TAIEX, all up more than 2% today. And Samsung here really leading gains with expectations for its earnings, especially as we look ahead for its preliminary earnings this Thursday. And TSMC, not to mention, up more than 6% today. And that's also after Goldman Sachs raising its price target by 35%, talking about how AI is likely going to be that multi-year growth driver for the stock. So a lot of these individual factors, but they're all pointing to that big theme still being AI.
There are risks, Winnie. What are the risks that could derail this rally?
Yeah, exactly. So as you see more optimism around AI coming up, there is actually still, risks that we always talk about in terms of valuations and in terms of how this can potentially be a bubble. So yes, AI is that big thing that we're watching this year, but also especially for when it comes to the Asia AI space. On one hand, you can say that it's a cheaper way to get exposure to tech, but on the other hand, you're also seeing concentration risks increasing for this space. So whenever there is the downturn when it comes to the U.S. tech space, there is likely going to be quite a big spillover when it comes to the Asia tech names, especially the names in Taiwan, in Japan, and in South Korea, just because of that exposure to the global supply chain. So we're really closely watching that. But on the other hand, more optimism is coming up when it comes to the China tech space, especially when you look at all these China chip makers IPOs when it comes to MetaX and also more threats. That's really showing that the optimism is behind China tech and the government's support for that sector.
We know, Winnie, that it's not just about tech. What are the other themes that investors are watching out for? Are they looking at central banks, for instance?
Yeah, exactly. So central bank path is really a key focus when it comes to the Asian markets. And the interesting thing here is that the paths are starting to diverge more into this year. Yes, you've got the Fed expecting to cut rates twice this year. So that's going to open up more space for Asia's central banks to cut rates, especially helping countries, for example, Thailand, Indonesia, and India to have a further space to ease and also to support the growth of the economy. But on the other hand, when it comes to Bank of Japan or central banks in Australia, in New Zealand, they're more on the rate hike path. So that is likely going to add a bit more pressure when it comes to stocks, but also that's part of the effort that they need to tackle when it comes to inflation. So we'll see how those paths are going to affect stocks going forward.
Winnie Xu, thank you. Bloomberg Asia Equities reporter there. Let's get perspective from Charu Chanana, Chief Investment Strategist at Saxo. Charu, good to have you with us. Happy New Year. I'm just wondering, is the divergence in central bank policy driving sentiment?
Hi, Haslinda. Happy New Year to you as well. Thank you for having me back. Yeah, absolutely. I think even though I think the themes that are dominating the markets right now are AI and geopolitics, I think obviously the Fed policy and the macro narrative continues to be very important, particularly going into this year. When there is a little bit of an uncertainty on the growth outlook. I think there is still a lot of optimism around growth. We still expect growth to go higher from here, but we know that the impact from the trade tariffs last year hasn't been as pronounced as it was first expected to be. Now, does that stay the same going into this year as well, or do we start to see those tariff impacts to be more pronounced? And that goes for inflation as well. I think we even if tariffs have settled in a little bit lower compared to what they were first feared to be, they're still considerably higher than the average tariff rate over the last 2 decades, right? So I think there is going to be potentially some impact, and that constant effort on reshoring will continue, which brings me to the point about inflation. question. There is, I think, a widespread expectation that it is not possible for inflation to go back down to the levels that we've been used to before. So certainly, I think expecting, on the same lines for the Fed to even cut rates as dramatically or down to 0% levels that we've been used to for the longest time, is that possible? So I think certainly the Fed policy is very much in focus, very much in flux. We do not have the data. We do not have the clear, outlook as to how to expect that. I mean, of course, the market's expecting 1 to 2 rate cuts, but that's not enough to really move the macro narrative in a huge way. And on the other hand, like Vinny also mentioned, this is the year when central bank divergences start to come back in focus. Bank of Japan has obviously been an outlier for quite some time now, but with Australia and New Zealand as well, really carving out a path of their own and not really just following the Fed, as has been the norm for many years. I think that central bank volatility is also something we need to continue to watch out for.
Central bank path is one, AI is the other big theme, and we're seeing, the surge in North Asian markets in particular, China, Korea, they're surging today, and that's driven pretty much by tech. That stays intact.
That absolutely stays the most dominant factor in the markets right now. I think even the US futures are pointing higher, despite all the US geopolitical risks. We see the NASDAQ futures even higher than the S&P 500, so clearly a signal that tech optimism continues to overpower any of the other narratives in the market right now. Certainly, there's a lot more volatility in this AI theme going into 2026, and we have our quarterly outlook from Saxo coming out next week, where we do talk about a checklist of questions that investors will be asking for these AI companies, obviously ranging from how much of AI-driven revenues or cost savings they are deriving, how much of the capex, which is obviously a big question, but how is that capex funded? Is it through cash or is it through debt? We're also asking questions like how is the governance and how are the profit margins shaping up? We're asking obviously concerns around valuations as well, which means there's going to be a lot more questions going into these AI earnings season, which obviously sets the bar much higher for an outperformance. And that's why I think, again, going back to what Vinny was mentioning about the Asia story, I think that is which is a more fundamental layer of AI. So this AI volatility actually drives flows out of those overpriced US, hype plays to really where the fundamentals really are. And that's the picks and shovels, the Asian markets, the Koreas and the Taiwans, the fabrication layers, which really continue to see demand and, flows despite the volatility in the US AI space.
So are we expecting to see an acceleration in terms of Asian AI plays this year? We saw how they gained last year. Will that accelerate in 2026?
I think there is potentially room for, obviously AI is a story which is still at a very, very nascent stage of its developments. We are much earlier right now to see the real benefits, whether it's in terms of productivity gains and, cost savings and things like that. So certainly that has a lot of room to move forward. And as that does, I think, the fundamental layer, as I said, for the AI story continues to remain very, very important. But having said that, I think Asia is a place where you cannot ignore the macro narrative. In the US, for the longest time, with all this hype around AI, I think we saw a little bit of a decoupling between the major AI plays over the last couple of years versus the macro narrative. But I think for Asia, that is a much harder benchmark to achieve.
By Asia, you mean China, you mean Japan and Korea
and Taiwan. I think overall the emerging markets, but also, yes, the more developed ones as well. You cannot run away from the overall growth outlook, or you cannot run away from the central bank policy, for example. So I think that continues to remain very, very important for Asian tech space as well. But overall, I do think that the potential for the Asian tech names to continue to outperform in this year is only rising.
The potential in China versus the risk that you see in China?
The potential in China is also quite substantial. And again, we've seen that over the past year or so, where there's two major themes there. One is that hope for a tech self-sufficiency, which means they continue to put capital behind innovation in the tech space. So that continues to drive productivity gains, technology gains, and it continues to drive flows into the Chinese tech market. But having said that, global investors still see a lot of risk in the China market. market and continue to question whether the China market is really investable. Obviously there are regulatory risks that can turn in quite quickly. But what I would say is that when you see those risks, they're already priced into the China tech place. So that is a risk, but that also is an opportunity. So obviously it's not about having a zero exposure to China tech versus going all in. I think having a modest exposure as a kind of a diversification bet in your AI story, I think China tech remains very, very important in the AI game as where we go from here.
And of course, emerging markets have had a fantastic start to the year, the biggest in a very long time. Is this the year that emerging markets will finally outshine its rivals?
They did so in 2025, and then again, today's price action clearly says that the risk of geopolitics has been priced well, which is one of the key risks for emerging markets. Now, having said that, the other risks being, again, rates volatility, which has not completely gone away. If we do see the long-end yields really being volatile or moving higher, given the US fiscal situation and the fiscal situation in many other countries, in Japan, for example, I think that could be one key catalyst to watch for the emerging market space as well. But if we were to see that or a sudden strengthening of the US dollar, I think there are, again, these macro factors that could derail the emerging markets rally.
Is there reason to think that the US dollar will strengthen from here?
I would say the base case is not for the strengthening of the US dollar. I think the base case still points towards a weaker US dollar this year. But of course, I think I would say that the probability that we see some shocks, like today's geopolitical angst, is helping the dollar push higher a little bit. So I think there are some scenarios where you can consider that the dollar could move higher. For example, if the inflation was to surprise on the upside as well and the Fed turned out to be less dovish than expected, I think that could be a clear risk as well for the dollar strength. And that obviously plays into the emerging market calls as well. I think one of the other risks to really monitor in the EM space is the concentration risks. We've seen this rally being very much driven by the tech plays, much like in the US as well. But for the emerging markets to be as concentrated as they are right now, I think that, again, the risk of a hype building in, despite being fundamentals being strong, but as investors start to move into those strong fundamental stocks, I don't see why they wouldn't even see some hype in the emerging market space. And that hype is, I think, pretty risky because we're very concentrated in the emerging markets indices right now.
Precious metals have had such a fantastic run too, silver playing catch up at the end of last year. How will they be moving this year?
Well, to talk about what silver did at the end of last year, I think, of course, there's a few stories, but the one that we should emphasize enough is the lack of liquidity in those last 2 weeks, which really drove the move in silver the way it did. But going into this year again, if you look at the gold and silver, the two big precious metals that we usually talk about, I think, of course, it remains. We've really moved away from that 60-40 portfolio to having a 60-20-20 kind of portfolio where precious metals really play an important part in this whole fragmentation game. The global economies trying to make their own blocks of power, and central banks trying to add in reserves and diversify away from the US dollar. So I think all of those really justify the fact that we still need to continue to look at precious metals, consistently. The fiscal stress that we are seeing in the US potentially, I think, again, that points to a good year for precious metals again. But silver is certainly the high beta cousin for gold, and I think that's where the risk of a crowded positioning is very, very important to monitor, especially at this stage, coming on the back of 150% gains in the last year.
And of course, people continue to talk about de-dollarization. What forex crosses and pairings are you keeping an eye on?
So de-dollarization is a multi-year theme which will continue because, again, I think a lot of countries, and especially after this Venezuela event as well, a lot of countries would continue to be have concerns around having a huge US dollar exposure. So this is not a theme which means that the dollar is going to die. It is a theme which means that we are looking for alternatives, and we would want to have something else in our kitty if at all our US dollar reserves were supposed to come into question. That is a theme that continues. So I think
would the yen be one of the currencies you're looking at?
Hasn't behaved like a safe haven in the longest time, I would say. But FX moves can be wild if they were to come to a point. We have to see this year a change at the Fed leadership, and if that does drive a dovish policy at all, I think we could see risks of carry unwind in the yen. I think potentially financially. That is not something we should completely ignore. But to think of yen as a safe haven because of de-dollarization concerns, I think those two things have become a little bit disconnected at this point. But I think when you talk about de-dollarization, again, we have to go back to talk about precious metals. That's where people are putting their money, because gold is the one which is not linked to any one country's sovereign rating or any one country's policies, and it's really the hard real asset which every country trusts.
As always, Charu, great perspective. Thank you. Charu Chanana, Chief Investment Strategist at Saxo. Still ahead this hour, we'll be dissecting the global impact of the U.S. raid that ousted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro over the weekend, the former Indian permanent representative to the UN, Syed Akbaruddin, and Victor Gao of the Center for China and Globalization will be joining us in just a few minutes. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. President Trump says he has big plans for Venezuela's oil industry and its vast reserves. Bloomberg Originals has been taking a look at Trump's possible goals for the country's oil resources.
The U.S. has carried out a series of airstrikes in Venezuela, capturing President Nicolas Maduro and his wife.
President Donald Trump has said his threats against Venezuela, the U.S. military buildup in the region, and the destruction of civilian boats are about alleged drug trafficking. But there's another issue Trump has been talking about.
The oil business in Venezuela has been a bust, a total bust, for a long period of time. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
Venezuela, on paper, has more than 300 billion barrels of oil,
or roughly 17% of the world's known oil reserves.
Most of those reserves are in this vast deposit known as the Orinoco Oil Belt.
But there's even more potential underground.
The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that Venezuela has more than 1 trillion barrels of oil in place in the Orinoco Belt. To put it in perspective, the world until today has consumed about 1.5 trillion.
The chances are they are going to outlast the world's demand for oil, so effectively they are limitless at this point.
And there already is a U.S. oil company that's been operating in the country for decades.
Chevron produces about 25% of Venezuela's oil today, is the largest investor in the oil industry and in the country.
We are going to run the country until such time as a proper transition can take place.
And subscribers can watch more Bloomberg Originals reports on the terminal and at Bloomberg.com. Coming up, we'll get the reaction from Beijing after President Trump captured Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro over the weekend. That interview is coming right up. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. You're watching Inside. We have headlines from Chinese President Xi Jinping. He says unilateral bullying is undermining international order. According to CCTV, Xi Jinping pointed out that the world today is fraught with turmoil and unilateral bullying is severely impacting the international order. All countries should respect the development paths chosen independently by other peoples, abide by international law and the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Now, on the back of that, let's bring in our China correspondent, Min Lo in Hong Kong. Min, talk to us about China's reaction so far.
Well, China obviously has been opposed to the strikes on Venezuela and calling on the U.S. to release President Maduro and his wife and to keep them safe, and expressing concern over this possible sort of detention and deportation of a leader of a sovereign nation to the United States. Also calling on the U.S. to seize any attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government. And of course, China also said that they were deeply shocked by the developments over the weekend and understandably and understandably so, because just hours before those strikes, a Chinese delegation was meeting with President Maduro, and this is a relationship that China has been cultivating for years, right? China has a lot of stake in Venezuela. It's one of its biggest creditors, pumping in tens of billions of dollars in oil-backed loans to fund development projects, to fund energy projects as well. It's also one of the biggest oil buyers from Venezuela. And when you think about the U.S. coming in to start to run this country, bringing in American oil company to take over some of the key assets in Venezuela, that is, of course, going to put Chinese interests under threat as well.
Min, the Chinese people have been active on social media with their reaction. What are they saying?
Yeah, there has been a lot of attention to this matter on social media, and many people are drawing direct comparison between Venezuela and Taiwan. And you think about the messaging that this sends. If the U.S. is saying that South America is its backyard where it can do whatever it wants, it's sort of sending the message to China as well, and even to President Putin too, that these leaders, they can do whatever they want in what they view as their spheres of influence. And China definitely sees Taiwan as part of its own sovereign territory. And here you can see a commentator on Weibo saying, I suggest using the same method to reclaim Taiwan in the future, saying that, you know, the extraction of a leader of a sovereign nation, that provides a blueprint for China to copy. Since the U.S. doesn't take international law seriously, why should we care about it? So a lot of people are discussing this now. Of course, some analysts are saying it doesn't necessarily change the calculus for China, because this is also a good opportunity for China in some ways to try to position itself as the upholder of the international rules-based order, as the opposite of the U.S. And also some analysts are saying that the Chinese military, it still remains a question whether they are capable of carrying out the sort of strikes that the U.S. is capable of.
Min, thank you so much for that. Bloomberg's China correspondent Min Lo. Well, joining us now is Victor Gao, Vice President at Center for China and Globalization. Victor was ex-Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping's English interpreter in the 1980s. Victor, good to have you with us. What's your sense? How does Beijing view the strike that the U.S. made on Venezuela?
I think China condemns such an act of aggression and intrusion into a sovereign country and hijacking or abducting a head of state and the first lady. This is purely, in China's view, a violation of the international norms and international relations and a violation of the United Nations Charter. And if the United States can do this to Venezuela, the United States or any other country can do similar things to any other country. And what really drives President Trump and the U.S. government is to seize the oil assets in Venezuela. Now, this is not American asset. This is Venezuela asset. And for President Trump to pretend that he will run the affairs of Venezuela is very presumptuous in the least, and also very much destabilizing the international relations. If any country can do this to the oil assets of Venezuela, they can do similar things to Saudi Arabia, or to Qatar, or to UAE. And where will be peace and stability in the world? So I think China wants to stand by the right side of the history, and the United States, apparently, in China's view, is on the wrong side of history. This will not make America great again. This will really be a very dark moment in the U.S. history. And in my best judgment, history will look back upon this event as the beginning of the end of Pax Americana, because the United States, through this act of aggression against Venezuela and against the sovereign president of Venezuela, is really starting a new phase in its development. It may eventually lead to the end of Pax Americana. No one in the world wants to be dominated by a domineering country.
Victor, might China be concerned about its own interests in Venezuela? Because by some calculations, China has lent Venezuela about $100 billion.
Of course, China-Venezuela relations are very close, and we cooperate with each other fully. And this is all normal contracts. And for the United States to launch such a blatant act of aggression against Venezuela is a matter of great concern to China. And China wants to call for stability and China wants to continue working relations with Venezuela, especially with the current government. And if there will be a new government eventually in due course, of course, China wants to maintain normal relations with the future government in Venezuela. But all this is no small matter, because what the United States is doing is not only negatively impacting on the legitimate business interests of China and Venezuela, it really undermines the international norms. And if this becomes a precedent, I think the United States will strike fear in many other countries in the world. And allow me to mention, philosophically, striking fear is not equivalent to gaining respect. Fear is not getting respect, and the United States will be better served if it gains respect rather than striking fear in other countries.
What do you make of the timing of the event? We know that President Maduro had just met with Chinese special envoy moments before he was snatched from his own country. Might Venezuela be sending China a message?
Well, China stands firm on matters of principle, and China protects its own sovereignty and territorial integrity without any reservation. And the fact that the Chinese special envoy met with President Maduro and the foreign minister, for example, is an indication that China-Venezuela relations are very close, and the two countries respect each other and deal with each other for mutual benefit. And the fact that the U.S. raid into Caracas happened just hours after the very important meeting is not surprising at all, because the United States has been working on the situation for months. And President Trump even mentioned that they plan to start this raid quite a few days ago, but because of the weather condition, they slowed down till the wee hours of the second day of the new year. Now, there is a coincidence, of course, but I think the United States might have taken this a very dramatic action of aggression against Venezuela with or without this important meeting of Chinese special envoy with President Maduro. What matters is, I was trained in the United States, and for many decades, the United States has called itself as the beacon on the top of the mountain. And the rest of the world, many countries in the world, actually believe that. But I think through this act, the United States probably is suffering a free fall from the top of the mountain into the abyss of the rule of the jungle. And this is not a very good day for the United States. I hope President Trump and his government will realize that the philosophy of don't do unto others what you don't want others do unto you is prevailing and will be a lasting wisdom for the United States and for many other countries in the world.
How are you responding to what the Chinese people are doing? They're taking to social media, expressing that perhaps this is a template, a blueprint for China in its dealings with Taiwan.
Well, the Chinese social media is very active. Hundreds of millions of people keep chatting around about all things under the sun, for example. But I will not be very much moved by these sentiments. I think China has its own timetable and its own rationale and its own methodology about unifying with Taiwan. Eventually, the unification is a megatrend in the world. No country, no groups of countries will ever have any capability of blocking China's reunification. But you may know for decades, China has been pursuing peaceful reunification. There are ups and downs involving the separatists in Taiwan, involving the U.S. Overselling of weapons to Taiwan, which I call as a ripoff of the people in Taiwan. So China will control its own timetable. China will control its own logic in terms of how to achieve reunification. And I think, personally, there is no comparison between what the United States is doing to Venezuela and to President Maduro and the First Lady on the one side, as compared with what China may eventually do to achieve reunification with Taiwan.
Victor, thank you so much for your time today. Victor Gao, Vice President at Center for China and Globalization. Well, in the markets, meantime, we have Japan's Nikkei 225 rising 3% on AI-related gains, as well as the weak yen, which is helping exporters, of course, in the broader market. Asian markets are, or rather Asian stocks are at a record high. Notwithstanding what we saw over the weekend, the U.S. Snatching President Nicolas Maduro and having him in the U.S. right now. Japan's Nikkei 225 rising on AI-related gains, and the weak yen, it is up about 3% as we speak. Now, still to come, former Indian permanent representative to the United Nations and current Kautilya School of Public Policy Dean Syed Akbaruddin will be joining us to discuss the diplomatic implications of the U.S. ousting Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro. This is Bloomberg. Well, earlier we heard about China's strong reaction to U.S. actions in Venezuela. India, though, has been very restrained. The External Affairs Ministry says the developments are a concern and that they are closely monitoring the situation. Let's get to Syed Akbaruddin, Dean at the Kautilya School of Public Policy and former Indian permanent representative to the United Nations. Syed, good to have you with us. Why the muted reaction from India?
Well, Haslinda, the world is an uncertain place. The U.S. has been changing its rationale. India has a stake in global geopolitical events, but by and large, Venezuela is out of its ambit. So given the diversity of rationales that the U.S. has provided, uncertainty that is surrounding the events in Venezuela, India generally takes a cautious view. If I were to divide the global South views, I would say there are some, those who put norms first, there are some, those who hedge the norms, and then there are some who are supportive of the exceptionalism of the US. India would fall in the middle category of hedging the norms. So it expresses deep concern, but it doesn't go further because it's still unclear what is the U.S. rationale for all this. Does it want a change in regime? Does it attribute it to narco-terrorism? Does it think that there is a change of regime on account of criminality, transboundary criminality? Does it want oil? Does it want a Trump corollary? So there are multiple things that have been told. Watching from afar, India has taken a cautious approach. This is an approach it always takes in issues involving multiple interests. India has interests in Venezuela, but it also has interests with the US. So it's looking at all factors and watching to see how this evolves.
However you put it, though, Mr. Akbaruddin, Venezuela is a sovereign nation, and India has always emphasized strategic autonomy. How does it defend its position when it wants to lead the global South?
I think it's a fair point and a good question to ask. The global South is a diverse group. There are many other countries of the global South who've adopted a similar position. So look at what Indonesia has said. Look at what Philippines has said. Look at what Thailand has said. So there are countries in the global South who are hedging. And I would call hedging of norms doesn't mean a total abdication of norms. It means the very fact that you say that it's deeply concerned already is a clear indication of where its views lie. Hopefully, as things unveil, it will come out with a more granular observation on this, rather than jumping to conclusions. You're right that norms have been infringed by all accounts in this, but there are other areas for a country like India to look at and hedge. It did the same initially with the Russian intervention in Ukraine. It's done this similarly previously, and that's par for the course as far as India is concerned, because it does always a hedging approach to global norms. It's a neo-realistic part. It understands that, yes, norms are important, but it also recognizes that the great powers have often got away with the way they think, the way they act. So it's a midway path. I wouldn't say that it's totally different from other countries of the global south. It hasn't. In fact, if you look at the global south, even countries who've criticized the violation of international law, the undermining of national sovereignty, haven't in some way supported the former President Maduro. So there are gradations in this, and we need to look at that gradations depending on the interests of those countries.
Would you say that it highlights the limits of India's foreign policy independence, especially against a backdrop of a country that's trying to negotiate a trade deal with the U.S.?
So interests are always taken into account, and you're right that India is the country which has stood up and is now paying the price in terms of the reciprocal tariffs, unlike other countries who are now vociferous but haven't paid that price. So obviously it will be a little bit more cautious than other countries, but I think you need to look at it in a broader perspective, because it's not very dissimilar to how the Indian foreign establishment approached the events in Ukraine. At that time, it was criticized for not being vocal enough. Later on, it was seen as being for peace. So, I mean, I think there is a historical thread in that which is common, that in cases of these interventions when things are not clear, India hedges. So it's hedging its normative approach.
Mr. Akbaruddin, you are India's representative to the United Nations. Is the UN still relevant? I mean, its credibility has been damaged tremendously.
So you're true that the UN has been damaged. It's primarily because the world of 2026 is very different from the world of 1945. And the UN needs structural rearrangements or structural reform. And that's not likely because nobody gives up authority easily. That said, we always will need a body that people can convene and express their views. Some people call it the sacred drama. That is, it's dramatic. People talk about it, but it also provides a opportunity to vent your grievances. And therefore, if we didn't have a UN, we would perhaps have to invent it. And the UN, as it's many times said, is not something that can lead you to heaven, but it keeps you from descending into hell. So it's a body which is like all bodies with frailties. It's the best we have. We have to make do with it and try and reform it rather than do away with it.
The thing is, there's no point in having a body if it doesn't serve any function. I'm just wondering about your thoughts on the unilateral action taken by the U.S. It's already talked about possibly Greenland as well as Cuba. What could the UN or other institutions, international organizations do to prevent a reoccurrence of such an action?
So, Haslinda, the UN was not created to stop big power interventions against smaller powers. The UN, as its original role, was to prevent big powers from fighting among themselves. For example, the US versus Russia, Russia versus China, China versus US, etc. That was the big goal. That it has somehow meandered through and worked its way through. It's not going to stop big power interventions because it's a default option in the UN that the big powers have a veto. And the idea being that you corner a big power, it will lead to a world war. And therefore, perhaps it looks aside when big powers intervene, but ensures that big powers don't get into a fight among themselves. So it's a body that looks at secondary level issues, not top level issues. And we have to make do with it as it is.
And what do smaller powers do? What do smaller nations do? They want a multilateral global order. What should they be doing now?
So you're right. The big shield for small countries or middle powers is to have a norms-based global order. And that's why you see the willingness of several small countries. For example, Singapore, Malaysia, many others, even in Latin America, Colombia, the present president of Chile, they all have come out with a norms-first approach. That is the hope that it will confer legitimacy, or it will never confer legitimacy on what is an infringement of international law. But for 2,000 years, we've known that the strong do what they can, the weak live with what they must. And that's the basis of the international order, because international law is a limited issue. It hasn't evolved as yet to counter big powers.
Syed Akbaruddin, thank you so much for your time today. Syed Akbaruddin, Dean at the Kautilya School of Public Policy and former Indian permanent representative to the UN. Now, before we go, here's a look at our guests for tomorrow. Crossmark Global Investments will be joining us to talk market sentiment amid concerns of sky-high AI valuations. Pictet will be with us to share their forecast for private markets as geopolitical dynamics test risk appetite of investors. That is it for Insight. Horizons Middle East and Africa is next. This is Bloomberg.